Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone is well. My name is Vinh. I am the host of the third in a series of podcasts by the LX Group. Joining with me today would be the Managing Director of the LX Group, which is Bally, Bhogal, and of course, Richard Moore of Richard Moore Solutions. Welcome back to you both. Bally, thank you for joining us again. How are things? How are you?
Very good, Vin. Thank you very much. How are you? All good here.
Really fine. Thank you so much for asking. Richard, fantastic to have you with us again. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Yes, thank you for asking. Not really enjoying this unseasonal weather at this time of year. We seem to have had 2 or 3 weeks now of wind and rain, and I'm feeling very sympathetic to all those parents whose children have finished school and are all away on their summer holidays in Cornwall and Devon, and it's not very nice weather.
Having said that, one could argue that the temperamental weather is actually seasonal for British weather, unfortunately, but it's something we'll never get used to. Thank you for joining us both again. Now, the subject of this third in a series of podcasts is the challenges of recruiting and releasing learners for off-the-job training. The third aspect of apprenticeship barriers, which we discussed in the first one, and we're going through each subject for each podcast. So, on to the first question and the most pertinent one. Bally, what are the main challenges that providers are experiencing with recruiting these learners?
Yeah, thanks, Vin. This is a really interesting question. Obviously, working with providers in the way that we do, during audits, any consultancy work, any training, wherever opportunities we're able to gain, to really get some insights into this. Always the responses are really interesting, and it's tough. It's basically, just as a starter for 10, it's a tough market out there, and not only from a recruitment perspective for staff, but certainly from a learner's perspective as well. So just if you look at all the choices available out there to learners, from a perspective of, well, is it apprenticeships, is it degrees, is it college, is it further training, is it a job? You're kind of competing on an apprenticeship front against all those various options of moving forward in life in general. Then on top of that, it's the whole challenge of finding the right person for the role. So we talk about job adverts. Have they been articulated well? Have they been written in line with the specification of the standard? Does the business understand their role and responsibility in recruiting learners? Does the recruitment department even understand the kind of compliance that comes with and eligibility of learners that comes with recruiting apprentices? For us, it's a really interesting area because we're finding now that the amount of work that goes in up front to get the apprenticeship and the apprentice right, so right person for the right role in the right business with the right employer, etc. For that to go really well, there's a lot more work that is happening up front, even with the recruitment departments, just physically trying to get the job adverts correct and well written so you can get the right caliber of learners in and really move the apprenticeship on from there. There's a lot more education that we're seeing is happening up front, but it's a tough market just for recruitment in itself, for recruiting apprentices.
I suppose it's comparable to just hiring someone for a standard job as per se, but on top of that, there's so much more. And you mentioned compliance as well, which we went through in the previous podcast. I'd imagine in summary that there's far more barriers to consider when hiring someone for an apprenticeship, a learner, as opposed to just a normal job. Have I got that right?
Yeah, you'd be along the right lines with that. Just from an aged perspective, from those checking of really assessing the individual. What have they done previously? Does it prove? Does any kind of assessment against what qualifications and certifications and prior learning they already have? Does it sort of if you like, inhibit them from going on to this particular apprenticeship program? Do they know too much from the knowledge, skills and behaviours perspective? So there's a lot more checking and diagnostic work that has to go into assessment of individuals for roles, for apprenticeship roles, at that upfront stage, if you like, than perhaps even for normal roles.
Thank you, Bally. Richard, what are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, thank you very much, Vin. I'd agree with a lot of what Bally's said. I'd certainly pick up on some of the barriers that I think that are in place for a lot of the higher level apprenticeships. The employees do tend to be pre-employed by their companies, because you're not going to come onto a level 5 ops manager or level 7 senior leader apprenticeship as a brand new apprentice to the sector. So I think some of the barriers around the degree of knowledge, skills and behaviours that learners have already got, and being able to evidence that they're going to develop new knowledge, skills and behaviours. I think a lot of providers are very savvy of the fact that Ofsted pick up on that if those pre-employed learners already have the knowledge, skills and behaviours. I think apprenticeship standards are perhaps still not that recognised by a lot of employers, and I think you see this often come through when the learners are doing a professional qualification within the standard. The employer and the learner is much more interested in the industry recognised qualification than perhaps the apprenticeship standard. Although I think things are a lot better, apprenticeships still have an image problem. They're still seen as a route for non-academic young people who are not going to go through A levels and through university. So I think there's still an image problem around apprenticeships. I think there's a big issue with employers wanting to put their staff on level 4 to 7 apprenticeships, and are much less interested in training perhaps their new starters and lower level employees through level 2 and level 3 apprenticeships. And undoubtedly for employers, and I think Bally mentioned all of these things, and Vinh, you alluded to it when you said it's the kind of same problem for employers. We've got the cost of living crisis. We've got a lot of these companies who've got shortages of employees, particularly when we think around things like Brexit, and we've got a lot of high staff turnover. There is no doubt these days that I think particularly young people in job roles change their jobs much more frequently than they used to. So I think that causes problems as well. And I think you put all that into the mix, and the market for learners coming onto apprenticeships, when you look across the piece and you talk to providers, does appear to be a shrinking one.
Thank you, Richard. There was one point in particular that you made up that I wanted to follow up on, and you mentioned the image that apprenticeships have, and I did have some thoughts on that. When you say image, is this from the perspective of the employers themselves? And as a follow-up to that, do you think this image is completely unfounded? Because a lot of these employers, from the perspective of business need, for example, they're having to deal with apprentices taking off at least 6 hours a week for off-the-job training. And of course, this can have an impact on their business. And it's possible that some employers are finding that more and more difficult to manage, especially nowadays, as you mentioned, with the cost of living and the impact it's had on businesses. And along with the off-the-job training, it's proving difficult for employers to even manage that overall. Where do you think the image of apprenticeships comes from? Do you think it comes from the employers themselves?
It's an interesting topic that we'll probably debate for the rest of the afternoon. It finds its roots, for the most part, in what goes on in schools, where, if I was to be blunt and slightly controversial, most school teachers and managers within schools have gone through what is commonly called the gold standard route. They've done GCSE, they've done A level, they've gone to university. A lot of them have gone straight into teaching rather than into working with employers, and they only know what they know. And although there's been a lot of work, particularly through the sort of the Baker Clause and other legislation, to try and get schools to make sure that they are giving an equal weighting and level of importance to apprenticeships as a progression route for young people, that is changing, but it's still, I think, we're on a journey to that. I do now meet a lot of learners who, perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, having been to university and been perhaps badly advised, have realised that an apprenticeship would have been the best thing for them in the first place, and find themselves therefore doing an apprenticeship at age 24, 25, having been to university. They've got a degree in a particular subject area, which they've then realised, they can't find a job related to that degree. They've enrolled on a digital marketing apprenticeship, let's say, and their career is really kicking on. But they weren't given the right advice, perhaps before going to university, that would have been an option for them. And of course, again, one has to be blunt. There is a lot of academic educational snobbery in this country around apprenticeships. Most parents and carers still, the social pressure is to do A levels and go to university, not to enroll on an apprenticeship. That is changing, but I think often only with the benefit of hindsight, once learners have been to university and perhaps realised they could have gone down another route.
That actually led into my next question quite seamlessly, because when you said that this is changing and we are all seeing the effects, because the traditional route of going down the route of finishing GCSEs, then your A levels, and then going on to a degree or even a master's, it is seen as the typical route into a career, but less so now than before. To my understanding, that it is in reflection of the standards of living and the cost of living crisis. But the problems that you mentioned earlier, in regards to snobbery, for example, you did mention that this is changing. Obviously, some people have encountered a solution to that and they are implementing it. But what exactly is that solution, in your opinion, Richard?
There is now increasing pressure through legislation, and also through the Baker Clause, and also increasing pressure from organisations like Ofsted when they carry out schools inspections to make sure that apprenticeships are given a fair crack of the whip, and that young people are advised as much about the apprenticeship route as they are about going down the A level and university route. So I think there's that. I think there's the role models have helped in that. I think increasingly young people are meeting peers who've gone down the apprenticeship route and have been very successful and often travelled further in their career than somebody who's done A levels and university. I know one of my daughters went out with a young man who was doing an apprenticeship and came home and said, "Oh gosh, I wish I'd done an apprenticeship. I never had any idea you could do an apprenticeship. I knew nothing about them." And she'd done A levels and gone to university. Don't laugh. You probably find programs like The Apprentice and helping to sort of boost the image of apprenticeships as a viable route, often a fast track route into a very successful career by the time you're sort of in your mid-20s.
Bally, in your extensive experience as an apprenticeship leader, have you encountered people who have undertaken these solutions in your time, and are there any other solutions that you can think of?
It's really interesting. I mean, I've really loved listening to Richard's take on everything you've just discussed, and I completely agree with it. But it made me laugh. I'm sat here because I'm thinking of my sister. Exactly what Richard's just described is my sister. So my younger sister, she's a head of art and digital at a secondary school, but exactly what you described, Richard, in terms of doing her GCSEs, doing her A levels, doing her teaching qualification, and then doing her postgraduate educational course, going into her NQT, so first year, second year, if you like, of newly qualified teacher status, and then has worked in schools ever since. And it's been about 20 years, so she doesn't really have any experience of working in industry, and so is not really able to advise children from that degree. Like, when you have experience of working in industry in certain sectors and you bring in that to the classroom. So I've seen that play out, and Richard's absolutely right. There's a lot of teachers in that that go exactly through that route, and that affects recruitment, and that affects sort of recruitment of apprenticeships. It affects positioning. of apprenticeships, everything that you've just described. The other stuff that's really affecting apprenticeships is COVID and kind of the hybrid working and the way that children want to work nowadays, and the fact they want to work remotely and they want to be at distance from the employer as well. So there's so many things that are contributing to this. But from a recruitment perspective, I think one of the, if you like, some of the key stakeholders that can help are parents. And Richard's mentioned that as a parent, he said that his daughter came home and was all of a sudden very enthusiastic and very, very vocal positively about apprenticeships. I mean, I'm a parent to a 14-year-old, nearly 15, well, nearly 25, you know, and a 12-year-old. And they're both doing really well at school, but I hope they go on to do apprenticeships. I really do want it for them. So that's me as a parent. I will advise them of all the options that are available to them, and I'll make sure that apprenticeships is a very real option that's presented to them, and that I think parents can really help with the challenges that perhaps providers and employers have around recruitment, and help to change the image as Richard's referred to it. And again, just to give you a very real example, we're having some construction work done on our house, and one of the builders came and he said that he's persuading his daughter to do a degree apprenticeship, so he's looking into that now, because he doesn't really think that going to university and coming out with all that debt is something that he wants his child to have. And these are people that are, you know, skilled, very highly skilled people. Even they're looking at it. So I was having a really good chat to our builder about it, and I was really nicely surprised actually that he knew so much about apprenticeships. And when he mentioned degree apprenticeships, I thought that's good. Again, as parents, Richard's mentioned role models, they all work. I think one of the areas we haven't mentioned yet, which the young ones really live up to and live inside of almost, is social media. So I think social media can help to change the positioning, the image, how people view apprenticeships. I think sometimes all that marketing's done by the legislators, the government, but it really needs to come from real people to really be able to inspire some of the younger generations, and it's not just younger, but you know, even mature. Sometimes I work with some of our providers and I get so enthusiastic about how they deliver their apprenticeships to their apprentices, and how frankly they roll out the red carpet for some of them, and I just wish I was 30 years younger.
I see. And obviously from the perspective of parents, like both of yourself, I'm not a parent yet, but evidently you both think apprenticeships are definitely a good idea. I myself have done both a degree and an apprenticeship, and apprenticeships definitely have a lot of benefits over a degree, especially nowadays. But we'll save that topic for a later podcast, because we could talk for hours about the perspective of parents in regards to apprenticeships, which is a very deep subject, I think. Conversely, I'm interested in the perspective of an employer. Now, they have to be very concerned about off-the-job training, and it's often a barrier which they encounter, not just in regards to tracking or managing it, or even providing the evidence for that. And it can inevitably lead to a lowering of standards and quality, something, Bally, I'm sure you've encountered quite often. So how are employers meant to manage this? It is an extra load of work on top of the day-to-day operations of their business. What are your thoughts on that, Bally?
Yeah, we get to work with lots of employers, employer providers. Even in my sort of capacity as a business advisor back in the day with Business Links, Chambers of Commerce, I mean, I really love anything to do with entrepreneurship, business development, business management, and get quite geeky about it. But yeah, it's a real tough old time for employers at the moment, and there's a lot of pressure on them for all the reasons we've described and talked about. But with regards to letting people off for learning and development whilst they're on a structured program of learning, that can be quite tough. And I think we can understand that. We've mentioned Brexit, we've mentioned COVID, we've mentioned hybrid working, you know, trying to get people back into the workplace, etc., etc. So, you know, this is a real tough one. But I'll be honest, there's no silver bullet for this. It's good old-fashioned organisation, planning of work, planning of, you know, the day, the week, organising tasks in a way that you can divvy them up so that, you know, nothing is left to chance. you're potentially backfilling roles, you've probably got colleagues on rotation, you've probably placed a bit of catch-up time for tasks that need to be done. Obviously, you'll always get that, that urgent thing that comes in of the day in the morning that really throws you out. But again, we find that employers, really the only way to overcome these sorts of challenges is just really good planning, real good use of everybody's time in the team as well. So just making sure that they optimize the time of all the individuals available in their teams, that there's that mandating of time for OTJ and that they stick by it as well. So we have seen use of, the employers have kind of looked at when are their busy periods, when are their less so busy periods, and allocating the time off for OTJ during the less busy times in the day. But then even we've seen sort of when they look at the month or the quarter, it might be a sort of seasonal demand type of business. They might look to front load a lot of the knowledge or any classroom training or some of the OTJ up front when they know that the second quarter, for example, or third quarter might be more of their busy times. It could be, for example, in retail, that's a really good time, and logistics industry. So those are the sorts of examples that we do certainly come across. I don't know if Richard wants to add a bit more, but I'll hand back to you, Vinh.
No, I'd be more than happy to hear, Richard, you'd have possibly a slightly different perspective on this. What are your thoughts on this at all? I'm also interested to know, what your solutions would be to these ongoing issues with the OTJ, how they are often poor and unchecked by providers, and it's problematic to show the evidence of this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got the same range of solutions as Bally has, because I probably don't talk to employers in quite the same way. But what I would emphasise is how important it is for them, and if they're an employer provider or if they're working with a training provider, to really give this very serious consideration up front. I see a lot of training providers and employer providers who suffer from not understanding right from the outset that in theory and probably in reality, they're going to lose their employees for 1 day a week on average over the course of the programme, and that if they have not got arrangements in place to release learners for that off-the-job training, when Ofsted come a-calling, there are going to be some very serious ramifications that come from that, either for the employer provider or for the training provider. For the training providers that work with a range of employers, the implications won't be for the employer, it will be for the training provider. And I work, probably like Bally, with a huge range of different industries, and they all tend to think they're special, quite rightly, but they've got particularly unique reasons why they can't release their learners for off-the-job training. And I have to end up saying to a lot of my providers, you have to understand that everybody in the care industry thinks they can't release their employees for off-the-job training, but so does everybody in the retail industry, so does everybody in the hospitality industry, so does everybody in construction, in engineering. So you can't go too much down the road, certainly in Ofsted eyes, of thinking, well, my sector's unique, which is why we can't release the learners for their off-the-job training, because sadly that won't wash, and it won't wash with Ofsted, who will say, well, you should have considered that and considered some of the solutions that Bally has given at the outset. That was part of the commitment you made to apprenticeships, and if you couldn't make that commitment, you should have taken the learners off down the road of doing qualifications in another way that wouldn't have involved the releasing them for their off-the-job training.
To everyone who's listening, you heard it from the man himself. Very, very strong advice to definitely take on board. Thank you, Richard. Now, there's been plenty of issues which we've all outlined, and we've kind of touched on the solutions which would solve these issues. So what exactly does that look like is what I'm wondering now.
Yeah.
Lastly, what examples of best practice have you yourself witnessed, Richard, around releasing employees for off-the-job training?
I'm not too sure whether they're best practice or a little bit of obvious things. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, the first thing is the training provider or the employer provider themselves, if that is the case, have got to be really honest upfront about whether they can release the employees for their off-the-job training, which kind of comes back to what I was just saying. That means that if you're a training provider, you have really seriously got to lay it on the line up front as to what does that mean for the employer. Have they seriously considered that? Does the employer understand the different types of the job training? Because I think there's still a lot of employers out there who do not understand, and they tell me this, that it wasn't made clear to them at the outset that a lot of the off-the-job training could actually take place in the workplace. So there's one of your solutions straight away, is the employer realizing that learners, shadowing in the workplace, being involved in mentoring, going on specialist courses, being given tasks that are outside their normal job role, that can count as off-the-job training, as long as it's relevant to the knowledge, skills and behaviours in the standards. And I was working with a provider a couple of weeks ago where the employers, the line managers in the employers said, we had no idea for the first 6 months of the apprenticeship that could count as off-the-job training. So that's one fairly obvious solution. I think also making the curriculum plan or schedule very clear to the employer up front can help, including the dates that the learners are going to have to be released for any sessions that involve more formal training from the training provider. So that might be lessons or workshops. That helps. And I think consulting with employers up front, about how is this off-the-job training going to work? Are you going to be able to release the learners? What contributions can you make to it? Some of my providers are very astute in making a lot of the coursework very work related. So, for example, giving learners projects to do that are based on the workplace that they can do at work. The employer doesn't mind, because they are projects that are going to improve aspects of that employer's practice, and that can count as off-the-job training time. So the learner can record that as part of those hours. So I think, learners doing coursework that's related to the workplace, that can help in getting over this problem of essentially releasing the learners for what is 1 day a week every week. I think it's actually I think where this release is a big problem can often be with the higher level apprenticeship, the managers on the level 5, 6, 7 apprenticeships who can't give themselves a discrete day or 2 half days a week, and are having to sort of manage their own time to release themselves for their off-the-job training. Particularly when they haven't got contracted hours and they're just expected to work whatever's required to do the job, they can often find finding the time, if you like, much more challenging than learners on lower level apprenticeships who tend to have their 1 day or 2 half days, which seems to, in my experience, seems to be much easier to organise.
Thank you so much, Richard. As you said, some of these are quite obvious. All the more reason why to everyone who's listening to hopefully take it on board. Bally, over to you. What are your thoughts? What is an example of best practice around this? What examples have you encountered that others could benefit from?
Yeah, I think we've definitely had discussions of this nature with employers that they're struggling sometimes with releasing individuals with, for their OTJ. But I think part of the problem is just, Richard alluded to this earlier, is just not understanding the commitment that they've made or are making to apprentices and apprenticeships. So there's a lot more work that we're doing, if you like, around the line manager. So we're having to do a lot more if you like, knowledge building with line managers in our sort of consultancy and training work, and to really sort of build their knowledge around apprenticeships, how they work, what's the roles, and what are the roles and responsibilities of line managers, what's the sort of expected input of line managers, what's the expected time or the amount of time it generally takes to sort of, I say manage, but certainly monitor and provide feedback to learners, what's the sort of average times, give a bit more of an idea, also tell them a bit more around compliance and from a quality perspective what is expected of them. So there's straightforward just training for line managers. We've recently done an audit for an outstanding provider at the start of last month, and one of their heads of departments said that we really cherry pick our line managers. Like, we are so selective about who we pick to be line managers of apprentices, which I just thought was fantastic, which I've never heard anybody say before, because they said we need them to be the nurturing types. We need them to be the types that can impart knowledge. We need them to be the types that are focused on, and frankly don't mind developing the next gen of employees. So they look for the nurturing types of line managers in their businesses that they feel that they'd be a better fit with the type of role that needs to be performed relative to apprentices and apprenticeship. So that's a very long answer basically to saying line manager training. And then we talk now about sort of, your again, Richard's sort of provided a lot more detail around it, so I'm probably just going to wrap it up by saying your kind of mentality, your attitude and your mindset around off the job training. Like, do you see your learner going away for 6 hours as like it's I'm at a loss here, or do you see it as a gain? So frankly, how do you view OTJ? What is your mindset? Because for me, it's a bit like going to the gym, if I can use that analogy. Like, if you go to the gym and you put in a really good hard session, you're going to come back stronger. And over time, you'll see some incremental benefits. So I think we have to do our best in trying to change the mindset and mentality, and frankly, how OTJ is viewed. But that's my best analogy around OTJ when we're discussing this with employers, that if you allow them to go away and learn something, it will be of benefit, and overall there'll be an incremental benefit to you, your teams and your organization. And then lastly, really the only kind of two other areas for me to pick up on that we have seen some good practice in is frankly KPIs for managers for the completion of OTJ. So we've got some of our very large employer providers saying, look, we need to probably put it into their appraisals and into their performance development plans. This is for line managers, that we mandate so these are the kind of almost governance teams for apprenticeships and high senior leaders that are looking at performance of apprenticeships and apprentice programs, that are saying, look, we want our apprentices to succeed. We want our brand to show that we are supportive of apprenticeships. So therefore, we need line managers to really toe the line with this. And so we will put it as a KPI in their performance appraisals, that all the OTJ must get done. And then I suppose related to that, the final point that I want to make around this is that accountability. I think the fact that accountability piece is in there for line managers to ensure that OTJ is completed, so it comes from their line managers, if you like, in the kind of structure of hierarchy, that accountability piece is really important. And I don't think we see that, we certainly don't see it enough in apprenticeships. I think that's probably what I've got to add.
I think I'd just add very quickly on the end of that, of course, some of the reasons that we've talked about here, or some of the factors that we talked about here, perhaps rather than reasons, are leading to this consultation that actually off the job training might be rebranded and renamed. And I think there are three options on the table at the moment for renaming off the job training, because it causes a lot of confusion, and I think creates a negative mindset for a lot of employers and their line managers. One of the options on the table at the moment is to rename it as dedicated development time, which might help to change the perception that Bally was referring to. And interestingly enough, and Bally's probably the same, I've already got a number of providers who never call it off the job training. And funnily enough, one of them a very big employer provider that I work with, actually does call it dedicated development time, DDT, which sounds a little bit like a brand of explosive, doesn't it? But I think that can help to break down barriers, confusion, misconceptions about what off-the-job training really is. So going forward, that may help with getting learners more easily released for their off-the-job training when perhaps it's got a different name, and encouraging more employers to do it themselves within the workplace.
I'll be honest, I don't think dedicated development time rolls off the tongue as easily as off-the-job training, but it definitely sounds better.
Well,
for sure. And
don't shoot the messenger. It's one of the. I think there's 3 options, and I can't remember what the other 2 are. But there's a consultation going on at the moment, and I think we will definitely see a change of name. And I do sort of agree with you that maybe dedicated development time doesn't quite roll off the tongue, but it's something that can convey in a better way, as Bally was saying, that it is in the employer's interest for this training to take place.
Well, if I'm honest with you, Richard, you yourself as a leader in your field, if you're going to start using dedicated development time, I'm fairly certain everyone else will do in due course straight after.
Not sure about that, but yes.
Bally, Richard, thank you both so much. Are there any final thoughts on the subject before I summarize? Actually, before we go into that, there was one question, and it's quite a cheeky one, and it's not obligatory to answer, but you mentioned earlier, Richard, in regards to different sectors saying, oh, off-the-job training is unique to their sector, the way they deal with it. In your experience, so this is a question for both of you, in your experience, have there been certain sectors other than others that have proven, let's say, more difficult when dealing with off-the-job training at all?
Shall I answer that first and say probably no? I'm tempted to say NHS. I'm tempted to say the care sector. They are always very quick to tell you how difficult it is to release learners for off-the-job training. But the retail employers I work with, hospitality, the construction, can make equally good cases. And that's why I say to a lot of my training providers, you have got to be careful, because the first thing they often say to me is, oh, well, Richard, what you need to understand, Richard, is the sectors we work with are unique, and in terms of being able, the difficulties that they've got in releasing their learners for off-the-job training. And I have to say to them, you've got to be very careful to go down that road, because Ofsted in particular will have heard that from every single training provider in every single sector, and every sector can put forward very good reasons why releasing their learners for off-the-job training is extremely difficult. I mean, in the NHS and a care home, they might be able to say, well, customers being ill and requiring care is a far more valid reason than customers requiring to be fed in a restaurant, or to have their roof repaired, or their drains cleared. But sectors don't think like that. They are inwards looking and see their customers' demands, whatever they are, as all consuming and extremely important. And we haven't got the time to release our learners for off-the-job training because of those issues. So it is a tricky one, and you can kind of see why each sector thinks they are special and they are unique, and they've got a unique set of challenges, when actually they've never looked outside of their sector to realise that probably everybody has.
I'll probably just add to that, Vinh, because Richard has mentioned the NHS. I think they were one of the ones that really popped up in my head. But I was going to also say construction. I've also mentioned the same, that, from a health and safety perspective, when our apprentices are on rotation, that we have to really think about their rotation and the next project that they go to. And if the build is off track, or if it's beyond, then we can't make it happen, and it's really difficult, and all the rest of it. So yeah, again, construction's one that comes to mind. Teaching, our staff are off for 12 weeks of the year, so sometimes you hear that. And then there's childcare. So the kind of latest one that I've had is childcare. But I think what's difficult with childcare is probably, again, related to care sector, just because of the priority around it in terms of safeguarding, is that if you've got ratios in terms of the number of staff to, you know, little ones in the nursery, then obviously that is a priority from a safeguarding perspective over OTJ, of course. I don't think you could argue that, but then knowing that that sector employs apprentices and has always traditionally taken on apprentices, you'd think by now that they'd have worked out a solution for rotating and protecting that time for learning whilst apprentices are on those programs. But yeah, there are a few others that sort of sprung to mind.
And early years is another very good example of, and to do with the ratios, and one of the reasons why training providers who work with early years employers often find it very difficult to teach cohorts of apprentices and have to do it one-to-one, which is then very expensive, because they can't get groups of apprentices from different early years providers all together at the same time in the week or the month, because it's almost logistically impossible because of the issue around ratios.
I see. Thank you so much to both yourselves, Bally and Richard. I think the key word here is nurturing, Bally, which you mentioned earlier. And Richard, you've provided some fantastic insights once again. It seems that the issues of dealing with off-the-job training continue. However, we have alluded to the fact that things are improving in regards to this and for apprenticeships in general, and also that quite simply going back to the more obvious responsibilities of the employer or provider, i.e. time management, the training for managers, and etc. So with that, we'll finish there. So I want to thank again, Richard. Thank you so much for joining us once again. Your insights, as always, are extremely valued as a leader in your field. And of course, Bally, to yourselves as well, a leader in your field too. Thank you so much for your insights also. We'll wrap up there. So to everyone who's listening, thank you for joining us as well. Let us know what you think. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Get in contact with us. We have a LinkedIn page, or visit us on our website or our Twitter pages. Thank you for listening, and please join us again for the next installment of Apprenticeship Insights with both Richard and Bally. Richard and Bally, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Vin. Goodbye.
Thank you, Vin. Thanks, Richard, and see you guys again soon. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.